The snow had started early that morning, soft at first, almost gentle, like it was just dusting the mountains for beauty's sake. By afternoon, it had become a wall of white that swallowed everything. Hope adjusted her scarf, pulling it tighter across her face as the cold bit through the thick fabric. Her breath came out in sharp bursts of steam as she looked through the windshield of the convoy truck. Ahead of her, the lead vehicle was just a blurry shape moving slowly through the storm. She could barely make out its red taillights flickering like a dying heartbeat. She was the youngest in the group, a field nurse who had volunteered to go on the mission because no one else wanted to risk the roads this late in the season. The team had just finished delivering supplies to a small clinic in the mountains. Boxes of antibiotics, bandages, and oxygen tanks for children fighting pneumonia. They were supposed to be heading back to base before dark, but the snow had other plans. Visibility's dropping fast, the driver said beside her, voice tense. We should have stayed overnight at the clinic. Hope looked out again. The road had vanished under a thick blanket of white. The world outside had no edges now, no sky, no ground, just a never-ending storm. If we stop now, we'll freeze, she said softly. She didn't say it to argue. She said it because she knew it was true. In the mountains, stopping meant surrendering to the cold. The driver nodded but didn't answer. He kept his hands tight on the wheel, guiding the truck through the snow, following the faint tracks left by the lead vehicle. The wind howled around them like a living thing, shaking the mirrors, rattling the metal doors. Every few minutes, the convoy radio crackled with short updates. Voices almost drowned by static. Then suddenly, the radio went silent. The lead truck had vanished from sight. The driver leaned forward, squinting through the blizzard. Where are they? Hope reached for the radio. This is second vehicle. Can anyone read me? Over, nothing but static. She tried again, pressing harder, her voice louder this time. Still nothing. Then through the storm, a faint flicker of orange light appeared ahead, far too low to be tail lights. Hope's stomach tightened. Stop the truck, she shouted. The driver hit the brakes and the vehicle skidded slightly on the icy road before coming to a shaky halt. They both stared ahead. The orange glow was moving, small but alive. Fire. When they got out, the wind almost threw them back into the truck. Hope held onto the side mirror to steady herself, squinting into the storm. About 50 yards ahead through the blinding snow, she saw it. The lead vehicle on its side, wheels spinning slowly in the air. Flames licked from the engine, fighting the snow that tried to smother them. God, the driver whispered. They ran. Hope's boots sank deep into the snow, every step heavy. The cold air burned her lungs and her fingers went numb even inside her gloves. When they reached the wreck, 2 men were already trying to pull the doors open from the other side. One of them was yelling into a broken radio. The other was kicking at the door with his boots. Hope joined them, shouting instructions, her medical bag thumping against her shoulder. The driver grabbed a crowbar from the back of the overturned truck. Together, they pried open the rear door and pulled out 2 people, both alive, both coughing from the smoke. One had a broken arm. The other had a gash across his forehead. Hope worked fast, checking pulses, cutting cloth to stop the bleeding. Her breath came out fast, but her hands moved steady. The wind was merciless, biting at every bit of exposed skin. The fire died down as the snow swallowed it, leaving the wreck in eerie silence. The team gathered around, trying to decide their next move. The road ahead was blocked by snow and debris, and the radio wasn't working anymore. We can't stay here, Hope said. We need shelter. There was a signal tower about 3 miles back. I think it had a maintenance cabin near it. We can call for help from there. The others hesitated. The snow was now knee-deep and the temperature was dropping fast. But they all knew she was right. They couldn't stay in the open. Hope packed her medical gear, made sure the injured were wrapped in thermal blankets, and led the way back toward where she remembered the tower being. It was hard to tell direction in the storm. The wind shifted constantly and the ground seemed to tilt beneath her boots. Every step felt heavier than the last. After about an hour, the group slowed. One of the men, the one with the head wound, collapsed into the snow. Hope knelt beside him, checked his pulse, weak but steady. We have to keep moving, she said. We're close, but the truth was she wasn't sure anymore. The landscape looked the same in every direction. White hills, black rocks, and endless snow. She tried to keep her focus, counting her steps, looking for any landmark. Then a sudden gust hit them so hard it nearly knocked them off their feet. Snow filled the air like smoke. When it cleared, she realized something terrifying. She couldn't see the others anymore. The storm had swallowed them. Hello? She shouted, turning in circles. Can anyone hear me? Her voice vanished into the wind. She tried walking back in the direction she thought they were, but there was no sign of them. Only the endless snow. Panic crept in and she forced herself to breathe slowly. If she started running, she'd lose all sense of direction. She had to think. She looked down at the compass hanging from her neck. The needle spun wildly, useless. Her radio was still dead, her phone battery frozen solid. The only thing she could do was move forward and hope she found that tower before dark. Hours passed. Her legs burned with exhaustion. Her hands felt like blocks of ice, her lips cracked from the cold. The world had shrunk to the sound of her own breathing and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. Once she thought she saw a shadow moving in the distance, a dark shape like a man. But when she called out, there was no answer. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on her eyes. As night began to fall, she found a small rock formation and crawled beneath it for shelter. The air was so cold it felt alive, pressing against her skin, trying to steal her warmth. She pulled her jacket tighter, took out a small heating pack from her bag and cracked it open, holding it against her chest. The warmth spread weakly, barely enough to keep her fingers moving. She thought of the patients at the clinic earlier that day, the little girl who had hugged her after getting her medicine, the old man who had pressed her hand and said she was brave for coming all this way. She had smiled at him then, telling him it was just her job. But now in the dark, she wasn't so sure how brave she really was. The snow outside was still falling, soft and steady now, as if the storm was calming down. She could see her breath in the dim light of her flashlight, which was flickering. The batteries were nearly gone. She stared at the beam dancing on the snow, trying not to think about what would happen if it went out. She whispered to herself, half to stay awake, half to fight the fear creeping into her chest. You've come this far, you can't stop now. Her eyelids felt heavy, her body weak. Every muscle screamed for rest. But she knew if she fell asleep, she might never wake up. She forced herself to think of warmth, the sound of laughter at the clinic, the smell of soup cooking, the hum of voices. Anything to keep her mind alive. Then, just as her flashlight gave its final flicker, she thought she heard something faint, a sound that didn't belong to the mountain. A low hum. Maybe an engine. Or maybe her imagination. She lifted her head, squinting into the snow. There was nothing. Only darkness. The sound faded again, leaving her alone with the wind. Her body trembled uncontrollably now. She pressed her hands against her chest, feeling her heartbeat slow. The night stretched endlessly before her, silent except for the storm. Hope looked up once more, her breath barely visible in the air, and whispered, "Someone will come." She didn't know if she believed it, but she had to say it, because the moment she stopped believing, the cold would win, and somewhere far off in that endless white, an unmarked helicopter was waiting in the dark, its rotors silent for now, but not for long. The night stretched endlessly, and Hope shivered under the thin shelter of the rock formation. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold had settled deep into her bones. Every breath she took seemed to slice through her chest, making her chest ache. She tried to move her fingers, wiggling them slowly, hoping to force some warmth back into them. It was hard to tell if she was making any progress or if the frostbite had already started to set in. She tried to think of something else. Anything else? She pictured the small clinic she had left behind earlier in the day. The smell of medicine, the soft murmur of patients, the way children would watch her hands move as she cleaned wounds or gave injections. Those memories were warm, but the cold outside was louder, insistent, and cruel. Hope knew she had to stay awake. The snow had covered her tracks, and the wind could change direction in an instant. If she fell asleep, she might never wake up. She pressed her back against the rocks, wrapping herself as tightly as she could in the blanket she had pulled from her bag. The sound of her own breathing was the only companion she had. Time became meaningless. Minutes, hours, everything blurred together into the sound of the wind and the crunch of snow. She tried to hum a tune she remembered from the clinic, a soft melody to keep herself alert. Her lips barely moved and the sound came out weak, but it gave her a small thread of comfort. Suddenly, a movement caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of the snow and shadows, but then she saw it again. A dark shape moving far off in the distance. Her heart leaped. Could it be someone? A rescuer? Or another illusion brought by exhaustion and cold? She tried to call out, but her voice was small, swallowed instantly by the wind. Hope forced herself to stand, testing her legs. They shook violently, barely supporting her. Each step toward the shape was a battle against the cold and exhaustion. Her hands were numb, and she had to hold onto her scarf to keep her balance. The world around her seemed endless, white and quiet, except for the faint hum of wind that refused to stop. As she moved closer, the dark shape became clearer. It wasn't a person. It was a tree, twisted and black against the snow. She exhaled slowly, disappointment pressing down on her. Her body trembled, but she couldn't give up. She had to keep moving. Every step could be the difference between life and death. Hope knew she had to find the signal tower she had been aiming for all day. It was her only hope for getting help. Her map was useless now, frozen stiff in her backpack. Compass spinning wildly earlier had made it impossible to navigate. All she could do was rely on memory and instinct, hoping she remembered the correct path. Hours passed as she stumbled through the snow. Her energy was nearly gone, and her legs felt heavier with every step. She thought about the people she had helped at the clinic, children with frostbite, elderly patients who couldn't travel, and mothers who had thanked her with tears in their eyes. Those thoughts gave her a strange sense of strength, a reminder that her presence mattered. Suddenly, she tripped over a hidden rock under the snow. She fell hard, her face pressing into the icy ground. Pain shot through her side, but she forced herself to rise. There was no time to linger. She had to keep moving. Every second counted. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, and she felt herself growing dizzy. Hope stopped for a moment, leaning against a tree, and tried to assess her situation. She had water, a few snacks, and a small first aid kit, but her hands were too numb to use them properly. The night was cold and quiet, the kind of silence that pressed on the mind and heart, making every sound of the wind or snow feel enormous. As she moved again, she noticed a faint glow in the distance, soft and dim. Her heart quickened. Could it be the tower? She forced herself to move faster, even though every step was agony. The glow grew slightly as she approached, but then she realized it wasn't the tower. It was a fire, small and weak, struggling against the snow. Hope's mind raced. Someone must be nearby. A group, another traveler? She ran toward the fire, tripping and falling several times. Her body screamed in protest, her fingers and toes completely numb. When she finally reached the source, it was just a small pile of dry branches someone had left, possibly maintenance workers from the tower. The fire had gone out. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. She sat in the snow, hugging her knees, and allowed herself a few moments to breathe. Her thoughts wandered to the convoy she had left behind. Were they still out there? Were they alive? She didn't know, and the thought gnawed at her. She felt guilty for being separated, even though she had no control over the storm. Then she remembered something the driver had said that morning. If we survive, it will be because we don't give up. Hope held on to that thought, repeating it in her mind. Don't give up! Don't give up! She forced herself to her feet again, moving toward what she hoped was the right direction. The hours crept on. Hope's energy was almost gone, and her body felt like lead. She had to stop again, resting against the base of a large rock. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, but immediately jerked awake. The cold was relentless, the danger too close. She whispered to herself, telling herself she had survived worse conditions before. Not in this storm, but in the clinic, in emergency situations, in moments where giving up was easier than trying. And she had never given up. Not yet. She looked around, the night still deep and quiet. The wind had shifted slightly, blowing snow in a new direction. She tried to listen for any signs of life, any noise that could guide her. But there was nothing, only the whisper of the wind and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. Hope's mind began to wander in fragments, memories of childhood winters, running through snowdrifts with friends, the warmth of home. Then she thought of the patients she had treated that day. Their faces were vivid in her mind, more alive than the storm around her. One little boy's smile came to her clearly, the way his eyes lit up when she gave him medicine. She clung to that memory, letting it fuel her tiny, freezing body. She realized she had to keep moving. She couldn't stop. Not for herself, not for the people who were counting on her, and not for the hope that someone somewhere would find her. She rose again, dragging her frozen limbs through the snow. Each step was agony, but she forced herself forward. Hours blurred into one another. She tripped over rocks and snowdrifts, fell into small patches of ice, and struggled to rise again. At one point, she collapsed entirely, lying face down in the snow, too exhausted to move. The cold pressed in, and she felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness. But then she remembered the boy from the clinic, the old man, the mothers she had met. Their faces floated in her mind like lanterns in the dark, and she forced herself up. She had to survive. She had to see them again. As the night deepened, the cold became unbearable. Her teeth chattered and her body shook uncontrollably. Every breath was sharp and painful, her lungs burning from the freezing air. Her clothing, damp from hours of snow, offered little protection. Her hands and feet felt like they were no longer part of her body, numb and unfeeling. But she pressed on, step by step, driven by the thought that the signal tower was just ahead. Then, far in the distance, she saw it. A faint glimmer of light, tiny but unmistakable. Hope's heart leapt. She struggled to move faster, ignoring the pain in her legs, the numbness in her fingers, the icy wind that tried to push her back. The light grew slowly, flickering as if it were alive. She forced herself to run, stumbling and falling, scraping her knees and hands on ice and rocks. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the base of the signal tower. It was battered and weathered, standing alone in the snowy landscape like a sentinel. A small maintenance cabin was attached, its windows dark and frosted over. Hope ran to the door, her hands shaking as she tried to open it. Locked. She cursed under her breath, looking around desperately for another way in. Through a small window, she saw a faint light, a candle or lantern, someone inside. She pounded on the door, shouting, hoping they could hear her over the wind. Her voice cracked and broke, but she didn't stop. Minutes passed. Then she heard it, a faint shuffling inside. Someone was moving toward the door. A man appeared, tall and bundled in heavy winter clothing. His eyes widened as he saw her, and before she could say anything, he grabbed the door and pulled her inside. Warmth hit her like a wave, and for the first time in hours, she felt her body start to thaw. She collapsed onto a bench, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. The man wrapped her in blankets, muttering reassuring words she could barely hear. He gave her warm water to sip and checked her pulse. Hope closed her eyes, letting the warmth seep into her bones, letting herself breathe for the first time, allowing herself to feel relief. She had made it, at least for now. The storm still raged outside, the mountains still dangerous, but she had survived the night. And somewhere she knew, someone would come to guide her back to safety. The storm had finally eased, leaving a quiet white world outside the small cabin of the signal tower. Hope sat wrapped in blankets, her body still shaking, but the warmth around her was a small miracle after the endless night. She sipped the lukewarm water the man had given her, savoring it, even though each swallow felt like it burned her throat. She looked around the cabin, trying to make sense of her situation. The man had left her alone for a few minutes, muttering something about contacting the authorities. But she knew that in these mountains, even authorities could take hours, maybe a full day, to reach her. She had survived the night, but now the question loomed larger than ever. How would she get back to safety? Outside, the mountains were quiet. The wind had died down to a whisper, and the snow glimmered under a pale morning sun, untouched and perfect. It was almost beautiful if she didn't think about how deadly it had been the night before. She pressed her hands against her face, trying to rub some feeling back into her frozen fingers. Every movement was stiff, painful, but necessary. Inside the cabin, the man returned carrying a small radio. He fiddled with it, turning knobs, pressing buttons. A faint crackle answered him, and he sighed. "The main teams are grounded," he said quietly. "They can't get through. No one can until the roads are cleared and the storm is fully over. You'll have to wait." Hope's heart sank. Hours of walking through the storm, freezing nearly to death, and now she had to wait? But she nodded because she knew there was nothing she could do. Her body had already pushed past its limits. Sitting down, she wrapped herself tighter in the blankets, her mind drifting in a fog of exhaustion and cold. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a retired pilot named Peter was looking at an old helicopter sitting quietly in a hangar. The machine had been grounded months ago, marked unfit for regular flights, but Peter had spent years flying in harsh conditions. He knew the helicopter better than anyone. When he heard a faint distress call on a volunteer frequency earlier that night, it had caught his attention immediately. The message was broken, static-filled, and incomplete. It was almost impossible to tell where it was coming from, but something in the voice, the urgency, the fear, the faint hope made Peter act. Against the advice of the other volunteers, he prepped the old helicopter for flight. Fuel was loaded, medical equipment checked, and only one medic agreed to join him. The rest refused, fearing the storm. Peter didn't care. He had flown through worse. The snowstorms of his earlier years had taught him one lesson above all. Sometimes the only way to survive was to follow instinct. He started the engines, the helicopter's rotors shaking the hangar floor. It groaned as it lifted into the cold night air, but it held. They were airborne, unmarked, unknown, and heading into a storm that could easily swallow them whole. The storm wasn't gone. It had moved slightly east, but patches of heavy snow still lingered. Visibility was almost nothing. Peter's eyes were sharp, scanning the ground below for any sign of movement. His co-pilot, the medic, kept close to the radio, trying to catch any hints of coordinates or signals. Every so often, faint static broke through the storm, but it was nearly impossible to make sense of it. Peter followed the faintest clue, a broken, incomplete radio transmission that sounded like a plea for help. He adjusted his route, dipping the helicopter lower, skimming the mountain's contours to stay below the worst of the wind. Every second was tense. One wrong move and they could be lost in the white. But he refused to turn back. He had seen what desperation looked like. He had saved people before who had no one else. He wasn't about to let another die while waiting for official clearance. Back at the tower, Hope pressed herself against the cabin wall, listening to the wind outside. She tried to think, tried to plan, but her body protested every movement. Every step she had taken through the snow had left her exhausted, and the warmth of the cabin was making her almost drowsy. But she forced herself to stay awake, knowing she couldn't afford to drift off completely. Hours seemed to pass. The radio inside the cabin crackled faintly and Hope jumped. The man outside the door was speaking, but the signal was too weak. She pressed her hands against her ears, trying to catch words. Then she heard it, a faint hum, almost like the wind, but deeper. She froze, listening. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. It was mechanical, powerful, alive. Hope ran to the window, her body trembling with anticipation. Through the snow-dusted glass, she saw it, a dark shape moving against the white, coming closer. She pressed her forehead to the glass, her hand sliding down in disbelief. Could it be? It had to be. Peter's helicopter appeared over the ridge, its unmarked body almost invisible in the remaining snow patches. The rotors sliced through the quiet air, lifting clouds of snow around it. The faint beam of its searchlight cut across the mountains, sweeping the snow, looking for anything that moved. Hope waved frantically, her frozen fingers barely visible against the glass. The helicopter dipped lower, its searchlight catching her figure. She ran to the door, stumbling over the floorboards, shouting, pounding on the walls. The man inside helped her outside, and for the first time since the storm had begun, Hope felt real hope rising in her chest. Peter maneuvered the helicopter with skill born from years of flying in impossible conditions. The snow whipped around the blades, but he kept his focus sharp. He had seen too many people lost, frozen, or trapped. Every life mattered. The cabin lights reflected in the snow, and he saw her figure moving, waving, calling out. He signaled to the medic, who jumped from the helicopter onto the snow-covered ground. She ran toward Hope, her boots crunching in the icy layers. Hope collapsed into her arms, shivering uncontrollably. The medic wrapped her tightly in a thermal blanket, pulling her close. She whispered calming words, her voice steady despite the storm's remnants swirling around them. Peter lowered the helicopter as close to the ground as he safely could, feeling every gust of wind trying to push them away. He kept the rotors steady, fighting the mountain's invisible currents. The medic led Hope into the helicopter, lifting her gently, supporting her weight. Hope felt the warmth of the interior immediately, the hum of the engines surrounding her like a protective shield. She lay there, gasping, tears streaming down her face, and finally allowed herself to relax even for a moment. She was alive. After hours of snow, exhaustion, and almost certain despair, she was alive. The unmarked helicopter was real, and it had come for her when no one else could. As the helicopter rose above the ridge, Peter scanned the mountains one last time, making sure no one else was left behind. The snow was still thick, the peaks jagged and unforgiving. But the woman in the helicopter, shivering under blankets, had made it. That was enough for now. Inside the helicopter, the medic checked Hope's pulse, her hands careful but swift. "You're going to be okay," she said. "We've got you." Hope tried to nod, but her head felt too heavy. The warmth, the motion, the steady sound of the rotors, it was almost dreamlike. She couldn't believe she had survived, and yet she had. Peter adjusted the flight path, heading toward the nearest safe landing zone where medical teams could meet them. The helicopter was old, unmarked, and risky to fly in such conditions, but Peter didn't care. Every second counted, and every second could make the difference between life and death. Outside, the mountains stretched endlessly. Snow covered everything. But inside the helicopter, hope and warmth held steady. Hope's body began to recover slowly, her shivers easing, her pulse regaining strength. She wrapped herself tighter in the blanket the medic had given her, feeling the life returning to her limbs. The hours of fear, exhaustion, and near despair began to fade, replaced by a quiet gratitude. She had survived the storm, survived the night, and now, with the unmarked helicopter guiding her, she was finally on the path to safety. Peter flew carefully, scanning the horizon for obstacles. The mountains were unforgiving, but his eyes were sharp, trained, and unrelenting. He had done this before countless times, but each rescue had its own weight, its own urgency. He didn't speak much, he didn't need to. His focus was total. Hope lay back, closing her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe deeply. She thought of the clinic, of the children, of the faces she might never see again if she hadn't survived. She let herself imagine returning, helping, living. That thought gave her strength. She could do this. She would survive. The medic stayed close, keeping a quiet watch, monitoring every movement, every shiver, every sign of frostbite or hypothermia. Hope's body was fragile, but her spirit, exhausted as it was, remained unbroken. As the helicopter flew through the thinning snow clouds, the mountains stretching endlessly beneath them, Hope realized something profound. Survival wasn't just about skill or strength, or luck. It was about refusing to give up, about trusting that someone, somewhere, would come when you needed them most. And now she knew. Someone had. Part 3 ends with Hope being rescued by Peter and the medic in the unmarked helicopter, finally lifted from the mountains and heading towards safety, setting up Part 4 for her journey back and the unfolding drama of survival. I can write Part 4 next, keeping the same style, length, and human-centered tone, focusing on the flight through the storm and the challenges that still lie ahead. The helicopter hovered just above the snow-covered mountains, slicing through the lingering gusts of wind that had not fully surrendered to the morning. Inside, Hope lay bundled in blankets, her body slowly thawing from the deadly cold she had endured for hours. Every breath she took was easier now, but the memory of the storm and the blinding white landscape haunted her. The mountains outside seemed peaceful now, but she knew how treacherous they could be. One wrong move, one unexpected gust, and the snow that had almost claimed her life could still take it. Peter, the pilot, adjusted the controls carefully. The helicopter was old, unmarked, and vulnerable in these conditions, but he trusted it. Years of flying through storms, over mountains, and across remote terrain had taught him one thing. Fear had to be managed, not ignored, and every decision had to be precise. The blades sliced the air with a rhythmic hum that vibrated through the cabin, a sound that was oddly comforting to Hope. It was a reminder that she was moving, leaving the deadly mountain behind. The medic stayed close to her, monitoring her pulse, checking her breathing, and keeping an eye on the color of her skin. "You're doing well," she said softly, trying to keep her tone calm and reassuring. "Just keep breathing. We're almost there." Hope wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the relief fully, but exhaustion weighed on her. Her muscles trembled and her eyelids threatened to close. She forced herself to focus on the medic's voice, on the warmth of the blanket, on the fact that she had survived the night. Outside, the mountains stretched endlessly. Snow and rock combined into a vast, silent world, jagged peaks catching the early light. From this height it looked almost serene, almost untouched, but Hope knew the truth. She had walked through this terrain, fought against it, and survived only by sheer will and the courage of others. Every step she had taken, every decision to keep moving, had brought her to this helicopter, to this moment. Peter's voice broke the quiet hum of the rotor blades. "There's a landing zone coming up," he said, scanning the ground. "It's rough, but it's the only option until we reach the base. Stay calm." His hands moved with precision over the controls, the years of experience visible in every motion. The helicopter tilted slightly as he prepared to descend, and the wind outside responded, whipping against the craft in sudden gusts. Hope gripped the edge of her blanket tightly. Her legs, stiff and aching, pressed against the floor, but she didn't move. The medic guided her hands gently, keeping her calm. "You're safe." "Just a little longer," she whispered. Hope nodded, trying to absorb the words, letting them seep into her mind and body. The helicopter descended slowly, the ground rushing up to meet them. Peter had found a clearing in the mountains, a small flat area where the snow had been partially cleared by previous supply drops. The blades kicked up clouds of powder as they hovered, the light from the searchlights cutting through the white haze. Hope felt the turbulence shake the cabin, but she focused on the fact that she was alive, that she was leaving the mountains behind. The medic moved beside her, keeping one hand on her shoulder. "You're strong," she said. "You made it this far. That's what matters." Hope wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her throat was dry, her voice too weak. She could only nod, letting the medic's words fill the space where her own strength had faded. Peter set the helicopter down carefully, skimming the snow to minimize impact. The craft bounced slightly on the uneven ground, but it held. Outside, the wind continued to whip and the snow swirled around the landing zone. Peter checked his surroundings quickly, making sure the area was safe enough to stay until they could continue the journey. Hope stepped out with the medic's support, the cold immediately biting at her face and hands, but she felt the ground beneath her boots solid and real. It was different from the slippery, uncertain snow of the mountains she had crossed. She took a deep breath, feeling it fill her lungs fully for the first time in what felt like forever. The air was sharp and cold, but it was real, and she was still alive. The medic helped her to a small tent set up at the landing zone, a temporary shelter for travelers and emergency situations. Inside, a small heater had been lit, and blankets were stacked neatly. Hope sank onto one, letting her body relax, letting herself finally feel the warmth. The medic checked her pulse again, noting the steady rhythm returning after the long exposure to the cold. "You're going to be okay," she said firmly. "Just rest a little and we'll get you to full care soon." Outside, Peter made a few quick calls on a satellite phone, coordinating with a regional medical team that could meet them at the nearest base. His voice was calm but urgent, a balance of authority and care. Every minute counted. Hope had survived the storm, but her body was fragile and she needed professional medical attention as soon as possible. Hope leaned back against the blankets, her thoughts drifting. She thought about the night she had spent alone in the snow, the hours of walking, falling, and struggling to stay awake. The fear had been constant, pressing against her from every direction, but she had kept going. She thought of the children at the clinic, the faces that had kept her moving, the promise she had made to herself to survive. Hours passed, and Hope felt herself slowly recovering from the exhaustion. Her body was stiff, but the warmth of the tent, the blankets, and the steady presence of the medic helped her regain some strength. She sipped water cautiously, not wanting to upset her stomach, and nibbled at a small piece of bread the medic handed her. Each bite was a reminder that she was still alive, still fighting, still moving forward. Peter joined her inside the tent briefly, checking on her and the medic. His eyes were tired, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his gaze. They had flown into a storm that others would not have dared, risked everything to find someone lost in the mountains, and succeeded. Hope looked at him and wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too heavy, too small for what she felt. Instead, she simply nodded, letting her gratitude fill the space between them. The sun had fully risen now, casting pale light over the snow-covered mountains. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in every corner, in every shadow, in every gust of wind that stirred the snow. Hope knew that the mountains could still be dangerous, that the paths she had taken were filled with unseen perils, but for now she was safe. For the first time since the blizzard had started, she felt a spark of hope, fragile but real. The medic helped her into a heavier coat and boots, preparing her for the next part of the journey to the main base. The helicopter had taken her out of immediate danger, but the mountains were still around them and travel would still be challenging. Hope's legs trembled, but she focused on each step, trusting that the pilot and medic would guide her safely. As they moved toward the helicopter again, Hope glanced back at the mountains she had just survived. The snow-covered peaks seemed almost beautiful in the light of morning, but she knew the reality had been far harsher. She had been minutes from death, alone and freezing, yet here she was, alive, breathing and moving forward. The experience had changed her, made her see the fragile line between life and death more clearly than ever. Peter piloted the helicopter back into the air, leaving the mountains behind. The rotors hummed steadily, lifting them higher, carrying Hope toward the base where proper medical care awaited. The flight was smooth compared to the storm she had endured, but the cold still nipped at her face through the vents of the cabin. She hugged her blanket tighter, closing her eyes briefly, feeling the steady rhythm of the helicopter beneath her. The medic sat beside her, monitoring her condition, keeping a calm presence that helped Hope remain composed. "Almost there," she said quietly. "Just a little longer and you'll be safe." Hope nodded, letting herself trust the words. She had survived everything the mountains had thrown at her. Surely she could make it the rest of the way. The landscape below slowly changed from jagged, snow-covered peaks to gentler hills and valleys. Trees began to appear, dark and solid against the snow. Streams and patches of frozen water reflected the pale sunlight. Hope felt a sense of relief wash over her, small but powerful. Life existed beyond the mountains, and she was returning to it. Hours passed as the helicopter moved steadily toward the base. Hope's body was still weak, but her spirit had grown stronger. She reflected on the people who had saved her, the pilot who risked everything, the medic who had stayed calm and vigilant, and the man at the tower who had given her shelter. Each of them had played a role in her survival, and the realization filled her with gratitude. Finally, the base appeared in the distance, a cluster of buildings surrounded by snow-cleared landing areas. The helicopter descended carefully, Peter keeping an eye out for any obstacles. Hope's heart raced. She was almost there, almost safe, almost able to rest fully, to let the experience of the mountains fade into memory. As they touched down, the medical team rushed toward the helicopter, ready to take over care. Hope felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. She was alive, and she was about to be in hands trained to help her recover fully. She gave a weak smile to the pilot and medic, a silent thank you for what they had done. Words were unnecessary. Her life was their message. Inside the base, warm blankets, heated rooms, and hot drinks awaited. Hope finally allowed herself to relax completely. Let